The scratching sound was the worst part. It wasn't the frantic scrabbling of a rat or the determined clawing of a predator. It was a slow, deliberate, dry slither against the thin wood of the bedroom door, a sound that spoke of a patient, unnatural intelligence. Dr. Ethan Hayes sat frozen on the edge of the bed, the heavy veterinary journal he'd been trying to read lying forgotten on the floor. His breath was a shallow, ragged thing in his chest. The only light came from the battery-powered lamp on the nightstand, casting a small, trembling circle of safety in a room drowning in darkness. Outside, the storm raged, but its fury was nothing compared to the quiet horror on the other side of that door. Then came the voice, a whisper that wasn't carried by the air but seemed to manifest directly inside his skull. It was a perfect, chilling mimicry of his own. "Dr. Hayes, let me in. It hurts so much." He squeezed his eyes shut, a useless defense. It had been playing this game for an hour, cycling through its terrible library of sounds. First, it had used the voice of Mark Stone, the rancher's missing husband, a grief-stricken plea that had torn at the sanity of his wife Jenny in the next room. Then, it had started using fragments of his own speech, words it had overheard, twisting his clinical observations into pleas for help. It was learning him. It was dissecting him. The scratching stopped, and absolute silence pressed in, heavier and more terrifying than the noise. He knew what was next. He had to get out. He had to find Jenny. But the thing in the hallway was between him and everything else. It hadn't started this way. 48 hours ago, his biggest fear was balancing the books of his fledgling practice. 48 hours ago, science was still his shield, a bulwark of logic and reason against a chaotic world. 48 hours ago, the silence of the high desert was the only thing that had unnerved him. That silence had been a lie. It wasn't silence, not really. It was the absence of familiar noise, a void that his city-bred ears tried desperately to fill with the thrum of his own blood. He'd gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as his truck rattled down the washboard road. He had fled the suffocating concrete canyons of Phoenix for a quieter life, for a penance he felt he owed after a routine equine surgery had gone septic on his watch. A stupid mistake, a moment of distraction, had cost a prize-winning mare her life and him a piece of his soul. He'd thought the vast, empty space of rural Arizona would offer a kind of atonement, a place where his skills could do simple, honest good. But this silence wasn't peaceful. It was geological, ancient, and judgmental. It pressed in on the cab, seeming to suck the very sound from his engine, leaving only the crunch of gravel and the whisper of a wind that had seen mountains rise and fall. Red rock mesas, gargantuan and sun-scorched, clawed at a turquoise sky so vast it induced a kind of vertigo. Cell service had died an hour ago. A modern umbilical cord severed, leaving him adrift in a sea of dust and stone. The call from Jenny Stone had been all sharp edges and dry desperation, her voice a rasp over a crackling landline. "My bull is dead." It wasn't a coyote, a diagnosis, not a request for a house call. He'd taken the job because his fledgling practice was bleeding money, but as he turned onto the final, rutted track, a primal unease, a vestigial tremor from some pre-scientific ancestor, tightened his gut. The Stone Ranch was less a home and more a last stand against the encroaching wilderness. A fragile wooden structure, its paint scoured away by sun and sand, it stood braced against the immense, raw power of the land. Jenny Stone herself seemed to have been carved from the same unforgiving material. She stood on the porch, a woman in her 50s, her face a topographical map of sun and sorrow. Her handshake was firm, her skin dry and calloused, her eyes holding a deep, weary caution. She didn't offer him coffee. She didn't ask about his drive. She just gave a curt nod toward a distant pasture, a place where the green was thin and bleached. "Over here." The heat of the day was a physical weight, but as they walked, a strange, localized chill began to seep from the ground, raising gooseflesh on Ethan's arms. It was a pocket of cold that had no business being there under the unforgiving Arizona sun. Then the smell hit him. Not the familiar ripe miasma of decay he knew intimately from his work, but something alien. It was sharp, sterile, with a bizarre undercurrent of ozone. The smell of the air after a high-voltage line has snapped. The Hereford bull lay in the center of a circle of trampled gramagrass. It had been a magnificent animal, a 2,000-pound beast of muscle and breeding. Now it was an exhibit of cosmic wrongness. Ethan knelt, his professional mind automatically clicking into diagnostic mode, cataloging the impossibilities. He saw no signs of a struggle, no churned earth, where the bull had fought for its life. It lay as if it had simply surrendered. A massive, almost perfectly circular section of hide had been excised from its flank. He ran a gloved finger along the edge. The tissue was smooth, sealed, as if cut with a laser, and cauterized in the same motion. It was a wound of impossible delicacy. Yet, inches away, the creature's throat was a mess of savage carnage, ripped open with a force that had snapped the vertebrae, suggesting the jaws of some colossal unknown predator. "No coyote does this," Jenny stated, her voice as flat and empty as the plains around them. "No mountain lion, no bear." Ethan straightened, forcing himself to breathe. He walked a slow circle around the carcass. No flies. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. In this heat, a body this fresh should be swarming, a buzzing, shimmering hub of insect life. But the air was still. The sky was empty. No vultures, no crows, nothing. The natural world was giving this place a wide berth. He scanned the ground. "Where are the tracks?" "There are none," Jenny said, "except ours." He felt his carefully constructed world of logic and reason begin to fray at the edges. It could have been people. Some kind of ritualistic killing. His voice trailed off. It sounded feeble, even to him. "No people out here." She cut him off, her gaze fixed on a dark, tangled line of juniper and pine that clawed at the edge of her property. Not for 50 miles. Not the living kind, anyway. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes then, but underneath it was something far older and more disturbing, a weary, horrified acceptance. This wasn't the first strange thing to happen on this land. This was just the latest chapter in a book she was forced to read. He took his samples, forcing a clinical detachment he did not feel, the slick feel of the unnaturally cold tissue a violation through his latex gloves. He photographed the grotesque tableau from every angle, the small, digital clicks of his camera sounding like blasphemies in the profound quiet. As they walked back to the house, the silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "Your husband, Mr. Stone?" Ethan finally asked, the formality sounding absurd. "Is he around?" Jenny's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in her cheek. "Mark? He took off. 2 weeks back. We had a fight." The words were brittle, rehearsed, a flimsy wall built to hold back something terrible. She wouldn't meet his eyes, her gaze locked on that same ominous tree line. Dusk fell like a dropped velvet curtain, the mesas bleeding from fiery orange to a deep, bruised purple. As if summoned by the encroaching darkness, Ethan's truck refused to start. The engine turned over with a single pathetic click, the battery utterly and inexplicably dead. Jenny offered him the spare room with a resigned sigh that felt less like hospitality and more like the acknowledgement of an inevitability. The house was a museum of a half-finished life. Mark Stone's presence was everywhere and nowhere. A half-carved block of cottonwood sat on a workbench, tools laid beside it, as if he'd just stepped away for a moment. The air held a faint, lingering scent of turpentine and sawdust. As true night sealed them in, the silence outside changed. It deepened, becoming active, watchful. It was that night, long after Jenny had retreated into the silence of her own room, that he first heard the voice from the woods, the faint, plaintive cry of a man who was cold and lost. The next morning brought a pale gray light and a renewal of the horror. 2 more cows were dead, this time barely 100 yards from the house, their bodies arranged in a way that felt sickeningly deliberate. Near one of the bodies, Ethan found the track. Pressed deep into the hard, dry earth, it stopped his breath. It was a single perfect print, long, narrow, and horrifyingly familiar, yet utterly alien. It had the distinct shape of a human foot, the arch, the heel, the ball, but where the toes should have been, there were deep, gouging impressions of canine claws. He knelt, a wave of vertigo washing over him. He stared at the impossible artifact, his scientific mind racing, trying to categorize it, to place it within the known taxonomy of the natural world, and failing completely. It was a paradox made physical, a footprint from a world that should not exist. He worked on his truck with a frantic energy, a desperate need to escape this bubble of wrongness. As he fumbled with a wrench, his hands clumsy with adrenaline, the voice came again, closer, clearer. "Jenny, I'm sorry, I'm lost." The mimicry was flawless. Jenny burst from the house, her face a mask of incandescent rage, an unbearable grief. "Leave him be!" she screamed at the silent, watching trees, her voice cracking. "You hear me? Leave him alone!" Ethan finally got the engine to turn over, the sound a glorious roar of internal combustion and sanity. "I need a new battery terminal," he lied, his voice tight. "I'm going to town." He had to leave. He had to breathe air that wasn't thick with dread. The nearest town was a small, dusty cluster of buildings on the edge of the Navajo Nation. He found what he needed at an old trading post, a place that smelled of cedar smoke, aging leather, and something else, something herbal and ancient, that clung to the thick adobe walls. The woman behind the counter was an elder, her name Michelle. Her face was a beautiful, intricate story written in a lifetime of wrinkles, and her dark eyes watched him with a calm, disconcerting intelligence. "You carry a bad feeling with you," she said, her voice soft but missing nothing. "From the Stone Ranch." Ethan was too shaken to be surprised. "You know it?" "The land is known," she replied, a subtle emphasis on the word, land. "The stones are not. They are new. They dug their well in the wrong place. There are places that sleep that should not be woken." She saw the powdery gray dust on his boots, and her expression hardened with something like pity. He felt an absurd, overwhelming urge to confess everything, the animals, the voice, the impossible track. "There's something out there," he heard himself say. "We've been hearing a voice." Michelle nodded slowly, her gaze distant, as if listening to a story told long, long ago. "You must not answer it," she warned, her voice dropping lower. "You must not follow. You must not let it hear you for too long. It learns. It is a mimic. A stealer of skins and voices. A ye not Luciai." She said the last word as if it were a shard of glass in her mouth, a name so taboo it felt like a physical weight in the air. "A skinwalker. It is not a beast, doctor. It is a sorcerer who has walked the poison path, who has committed unspeakable acts to twist the laws of nature. It is drawn to strife, to disrespect, to the disharmony of outsiders. It is an intelligence. A cruel one. It likes to play with its food." She looked at him then, a piercing direct gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of his skepticism. "What is your family name?" "Hayes," he said, the name sounding thin and insignificant. "Ethan Hayes." Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, a flicker of ancient recognition. "Hayes," she repeated, tasting the name. "There were Hayes men on this land before, long ago. Prospectors. They came looking for silver, but they were greedy. They did not leave on good terms with the Dene, the people." She straightened up, her face closing off as if she had said too much. "Be careful, Dr. Hayes. Some debts are not forgotten, they are passed down through the blood." The drive back to the ranch was a journey into a different reality. The setting sun no longer looked beautiful, it looked like a fresh wound in the sky. Michelle's words echoed in his head, a drumbeat of folklore and dread that was steadily drowning out the thin voice of his own reason. Some debts are passed down through the blood. He arrived to find Jenny sitting in the dark, the house cold and silent, as if she were holding a vigil. That was when the storm hit, and the true siege began. The psychological assault became crueler, more intimate. The voice was no longer just outside. It was in the house, whispering from the darkest corners, from the top of the stairs, from the other side of his own bedroom door. It used Mark's voice to recount intimate memories, the day they bought the ranch, a private joke, a pet name, each memory twisted into a venomous, mocking taunt. Then it turned on him, which led him to his current paralysis, trapped in the guest room. Under the relentless, tormenting pressure, Jenny finally shattered. He heard a crash from her room, followed by a choked sob. He had to move. Taking a deep breath, Ethan slowly rose, grabbing the heaviest thing he could find, the solid glass water carafe from the nightstand. He twisted the lock on his door, the click deafeningly loud, and pulled it open. The hallway was empty, plunged into darkness. The scratching had stopped. The whispering had ceased. He crept toward Jenny's room, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He found her on the floor, amidst the pieces of a shattered lamp, weeping. "It's my fault," she choked out, the words torn from her. Mark, he was worried, said he felt like we were being watched, that the land hated us. He found an old burial marker near where we dug the well. I called him foolish, superstitious. We fought. He walked out, into the woods, to clear his head. He never came back. The voice started 2 nights later. A sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the house to its foundations. It was answered by a sound from downstairs, the splintering scream of the front door being torn from its frame. They scrambled into the living room just in time to see the thing unfold itself into the house. It was a violation of all natural law. Vaguely humanoid but moving with the jerky, unnatural gait of a broken marionette, its limbs were too long, its joints bent at sickeningly wrong angles. A desiccated coyote skull was pulled low over its face, but from the deep shadows of the eye sockets, 2 points of light glowed with a cold, predatory intelligence. The stench of wet fur, river mud, and something ancient and wrong filled the room. It took a step, then another. It did not roar or snarl. It opened a mouth that should not have been there and spoke in Mark's voice, now a deep, guttural parody filled with graveyard soil and malice. "You left me in the dark, Jenny," Jenny screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure loss and terror, and raised the shotgun she'd been clutching. The deafening blast lit up the room, but the creature moved with a blur of speed that defied physics. The buckshot tore through the tattered hide and slammed into the wall behind it. With a motion that was both casual and contemptuous, it swatted the gun from Jenny's hands, sending her sprawling. The creature turned its glowing eyes on Ethan. It tilted its head, an unnervingly curious gesture. Its lipless mouth opened, and it mimicked the sound of his own ragged, terrified breathing back at him. And then it spoke again, in a chorus of voices. Mark's voice was there, but so were others, the lowing of dying cattle, the yelp of a coyote, and underneath it all, a dry, rasping whisper that sounded impossibly old. It whispered a name that was not for Jenny, but for him. Jedediah. The world fell away from Ethan, Jedediah Hayes, his great-great-grandfather. A prospector, a name he'd seen only once, on a faded family tree. A story, dismissed as a tall tale by his grandfather, flashed in his mind. Jedediah and his partners had murdered a Navajo family, a man, his wife, their 2 children, to steal their claim to a silver spring, burying them in an unmarked grave. Some debts are passed down through the blood. This wasn't random, this was a reckoning. A fury born of pure, animal terror surged through him. He was a man of science, but he was also the descendant of a killer, cornered by the reaping of his ancestors' crime. His vet kit lay open on the kitchen table. His eyes locked on it. Not a medical instrument, but a weapon. The butane-fueled dehorning iron. He snatched it, his thumb finding the ignition switch. With a roar that was part terror, part defiance, part a primal scream against the sins of his own name, he flicked it on. The iron's circular tip glowed cherry red in an instant. The creature lunged, its long, clawed fingers reaching for him. Ethan met its charge, shoving the searing metal deep into the center of its chest where a heart should have been. The shriek it let out was the sound of damnation. It was not one voice but 100, a cacophony of every life it had ever stolen, all screaming at once in a symphony of agony. It was the sound of Mark Stone's final moments, the terror of the cattle, and the ancient, guttural curses of Jedediah Hayes's victims. The creature recoiled, the stench of supernaturally burning flesh filling the air, and scrambled backwards, its unnatural form collapsing in on itself as it fled out the broken door and into the howling storm. Dawn arrived quiet and gray, the storm having washed the world clean, leaving behind a sterile silence. The house was a ruin, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt meat. Jenny sat huddled in a corner, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes vacant. She was a ghost in her own home. There was nothing left to say. Ethan gathered his things, his hands shaking so violently he could barely zip his bag. He got his truck started. It fired up on the first try and drove away, not looking back, leaving Jenny alone with the silence and the land that had claimed her husband. He drove for hours, the sun climbing higher, trying to reassemble the shattered pieces of his reality. It was a shared psychosis, he told himself, a folie à deux induced by stress and isolation. There had to be a rational explanation. He needed noise, normalcy. He fumbled with the radio, twisting the dial, seeking the mundane comfort of a weather report or a pop song. The dial swept across the frequencies, releasing bursts of static. Then, for a single heart-stopping moment, a voice cut through the hiss, as clear and close as if it were sitting in the passenger seat beside him. It was a perfect, chilling mimicry of his own. Dr. Hayes, it hurts so much. He stomped on the accelerator, the truck engine screaming in protest as he fled down the empty highway. He was driving away from the ranch, but he knew with a certainty that froze his soul that he wasn't escaping. He was just carrying the curse with him. The debt was his now. And the silence he was driving into was no longer empty, it was listening. The archives are now closed for the night. For more files unsealed from the shadows of American history, subscribe to the Folklore Archives. Your next case file is just one click away.